Okay, so the last thing we're going to do for today's lecture is we're going to take a look at how an elasticity analysis can help us make decisions. So remember what I said at the very beginning of our previous lecture was that you guys have already seen how to analyze the market using demand and supply analysis, but that is incomplete unless you know something about the elasticities of demand and supply. You can't really make good informed decision. So we are going to take a look at how elasticity helps us make decisions. And we're going to do that by looking at two scenarios. Okay, so let's look at the first scenario. So suppose the government wants to discourage the consumption of soda. Okay, because soda is bad for your health, and so the government would like to discourage the consumption of soda to improve the public health. And it doesn't just have to be restricted to soda. You can think of any demerit goods like cigarettes, for example, or alcohol. Well, alcohol is already illegal in Bangladesh, but in the rest of the world. So anything that the government wants to discourage. And suppose this is what the government decides to do. So let me just draw this. So we have, of course, quantity here. We have price over here. So let's draw a demand and a supply curve. So suppose this is the supply curve, and suppose this is the demand curve that the government thinks that the economy has. And they assume that this, well, not assume, they know that the price level is P naught and quantity traded is Q naught. This is E, which is equilibrium. Okay. Now, the way the government wants to discourage the consumption of soda is by putting a tax on the producers. So the people who are selling soda now have to pay a tax. Now, of course, we have not talked about taxes yet. You guys will do that in the next week. Don't worry about that right now. But basically what is going to happen when there is a tax on producers is that the supply curve is going to shift to the left. Okay, so this is what happens, or at least this is what the government is hoping will happen. So from S we come to S prime, and from E we have arrived at E prime. And so what the government effectively, by imposing tax, this area, let me draw it better. This is the tax amount. Don't worry if you don't understand it, okay? You will do it later. But what has happened because of this shift is that here, price has gone up of soft drinks. And as a result, consumption has fallen. And this is what the government wanted to do. They wanted to reduce the consumption of soft drinks. So by increasing price from P0 to P1, they have managed to reduce the quantity from Q0 to Q1. Or at least this is what the government plans to do. But however, suppose that the government is mistaken about the elasticity of demand. Over here, the government is assuming an elastic demand. However, suppose soda has an inelastic demand. Okay, so let's see what happens. So draw this again. We have quantity here, quantity here, and price here. This is still the supply curve, but now the reality is over here, the government had assumed a relatively elastic demand curve, but the truth is demand is inelastic. Okay. And so the equilibrium condition doesn't change. We are still at P naught and Q naught, and this is E. But now let's see what happens. So once again, government imposes the tax. This is S prime. And so this distance, same amount of tax. But what has happened to our equilibrium now? This is P1. So price has gone up. This is Q1. This has gone down. So here's the problem with the government's policy. When they had assumed an elastic demand curve, they were expecting that a small change in price will lead to a relatively large change in quantity demanded. And so they assume that imposing a small tax will see a relatively larger change in the consumption of soda. The problem is soda has inelastic demand. And as a result, even if the government impose a very large tax, doesn't matter, fall in quantity demanded is much smaller. You see over here, this distance is relatively larger, even though the tax amount, the rise in price is small. But over here, we say this is a much smaller area. And that is one of the problems. If the government decide how much tax they want to impose without taking a look at the elasticity of demand of soda, their policy is not going to be successful. They're expecting a large change in QD, but because they have failed to take into consideration the inelasticity of demand, there's a relatively smaller change. And so the policy of taxing soda to reduce consumption is going to fall. It's going to fail. Quantity demanded is still falling, but not by the amount that was planned for. So an unsuccessful tax regime.